The last speaker in this panel is Lana, who is professor of psychology at the University of Guelph. Lana's research centers on the study of attention and working memory and how attention and memory operations change as individuals progress from childhood to old age. In her visual attention lab, she examines the limits of our attentional focus and how we count at a conscious level as well as at a pre-attentive level where we aren't actually aware of the process of counting. Her applied research largely focuses on crash risk and factors affecting attention while driving. She will talk to us this afternoon about follow those cars, multiple object tracking out of the laboratory and onto the highway.
Thank you. Well, hello. So I guess I'm the last speaker, and I guess probably what you're all quite impressed with. Is it on? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. I just have, my voice doesn't carry very well, so I have to keep the mic close, I guess. So I guess something you might have all been impressed with is how varied Zenon's students are. I was a student at Western at the same time as Mike and Roy and Jackie and actually Ron Storm and Chris Sears and a whole bunch of other people. And at one point, actually, they came to be a time where we were all out in the job market at the same time, and at one university had 3 of us there applying for the same job. And actually one of the interviewers said, I can't believe it. These, why is it that Zenon students are all so different from one another? They thought they were going to be, choosing one of the same kind of thing, and they're just radically different. Well, I sort of, in a way, I started with Zenon's lab. Actually, I started on the lunatic fringe of the language research, actually, studying metaphor and talking about semantic space and all that sort of stuff. And it was kind of, well, I thought I was doing pretty well, and Zenon said, well, cognitively penetrable, sigh. So back to the drawing board. But I took minds and machines from him, and actually I really enjoyed writing programs and coming up with theory, and I really loved the theory part of it, and I actually got so excited by that sort of research that I decided to join Zenon's lab, and actually Zenon was doing a lot of vision work at the time. Actually, what I didn't tell Zenon is that I'd never taken a perception course. And as it turns out, we were reading Marr. And actually, Michael's version of Marr has all these insightful comments. My version of Marr has comments like, what is a pixel? What is binocular disparity? And so it was kind of a steep learning curve. But from that, I started doing work on subitizing and counting, and actually gradually built up to that. One of the things I took from Zenon, though, and what I thought was really interesting about him is because up until that time, I just really loved theory. I thought theory was so cool, and I was certainly going basic research route. But actually what Zenon did is he always sort of had a combination of application and theory. So as it turns out, even when it comes to Fid's theory, he was talking in one of his papers about how it is the insight for that came when he was trying to design a system that could actually derive information, like a computational system that could actually read a diagram and get information from it. And from that came the idea that you have to be able to select several things at once. It's not enough to just look at one thing at a time. Well, after I left Western, I was looking for a job, and I found a job at a new university. And actually what they didn't tell me about this new university is that you'd have to create the degree. And so I was desperately casting about. We were supposed to come up with a bachelor's of psychology, which was like none other in Canada for some reason. And the other guys didn't have to do this, but anyway, we did. And one of the things I had to do was try to figure out to make a way to make a psychology degree different. And the thing we settled on is making an applied degree, an applied psychology degree that it wasn't just clinical, but actually it talked about all ways you could be. So an applied cognitive degree. And so I ended up talking to people at the Insurance Corporation of BC. Now that's a group that is really interested in driving, and in particular in reducing collisions. And I was trying to talk them into supporting our degree because telling them our undergraduates could give you valuable skills. They would provide you information that was, they said, really? So exactly why aren't you doing driving research? Like you're doing attention research. And they were telling me that actually one of the leading causes of collisions is that people just basically, they're looking at things, they're looking at the road, it looks like they're paying attention, but they drive straight into things anyway. And so they were very interested in attention. And what they challenged me to do is write a paper that integrated all the basic research on attention, and there was a lot, and all the research on driving. Well, as it turns out, that was kind of a hard thing to integrate, because each of them was like a herd of cats. So you had one herd of cats and the other herd of cats, and you try to get all the cats together working in the same direction. It doesn't work. And actually, as it turns out, those two groups of cats don't like each other very much. So the basic research on attention actually only refers to driving when they're trying to get NSERC to fund them. They say, this might apply to driving. And they're right, you definitely should. But there's not that direct linkage. And actually, the people doing the driving research, they'll often say things like, this is related to attention, but often what happens is, well, they haven't been paying attention to a lot of the attention research. They take just what out of it. And so I sort of came to the realization that, you know, basic research without an eye to application, it runs the risk of being irrelevant, but applied research without basic runs the risk of having to reinvent the wheel again and again and again. So since that time, I've been trying to actually incorporate basic and applied research. And what this is a story about is exactly one of those projects. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my lifespan work in basic research, multiple object tracking across the lifespan, and then I'm going to tell you about what I tried to do, actually incorporating multiple object tracking into an actual driving task. So actually one of the things, and we've talked about this multiple times in the course of today, is Zenon contributed a new way of understanding vision, and this led to a discovery of an ability that at the time people didn't know we had. So at the time we were very focused on the spotlight of attention, or maybe the zoom lens of attention, very, very serial, one thing at a time. But Zenon showed that sometimes you can keep track of several things at a time, even if they are identical things. So in a classic tracking task, you start out with identical things, some of them flash, and then they all go into movement. Now, one of the things they found, and we've talked about this a number of times, is that people are really quite good at following more than one thing, actually up to 4 and sometimes 5 items at once. Even when the items are moving too rapidly for you to go move your eyes between them, or actually even move your attentional focus. Now what I've got here is the design for a study that looks at multiple object tracking, where people are tracking 1 to 4 items, and actually I've tested a wide range of ages, up to 75 years old. And what you find is that right there at the top you see the percentage of correctly identified targets on one axis, the number of targets to be tracked on the other, and you can see that actually the 26-year-olds are basically doing about 100% accuracy, even when there's up to 4 items. But you'll notice that there's pretty big differences between the various age groups. So the youngest, the 7-year-olds, the bottom line, actually, they're having pretty major problems, so their error rate's pretty close to 50% by the time they get to 4 items at once. Now,
Put that back. I want to see that again.
what?
Go back.
We want to see your data. We want to look at the data more.
You're suffering graph deprivation. I guess you didn't have enough graphs in the last one. So
That's right.
behold, a graph.
Which is the 75-year-olds?
Yeah,
So
we're
actually, look at the 75-year-olds, yeah.
How many of them were?
Well, actually, we had, in that study, we had, gosh, 28 or something? Yeah.
Wow, that's not
Yeah, so anyway, you can see the 75-year-olds are not doing as well as the 26-year-olds. Actually, the youngest children, basically there's an increase in performance up until around university age. And then what happens is it all starts falling apart as you get older.
Going to university is not good.
Well, one other thing is that you have to say, well, is this just a problem encoding the spatial locations of the items, or is it a problem in having to report the locations of spatial items after a delay. And so we did some control tasks, and we looked at percentage of correctly reported targets. And as you can see, it isn't really to do with report, at least for the oldest participants. As you see with the oldest participants, what happens is their immediate and delayed recall, those at the top two lines, are actually 100%. They have no problems recalling the spatial locations of a number of items, but their tracking performance is, well, not great. And so as it turns out, they're performing about as what you'd expect if they were actually guessing one target. So as it turns out, they're having problems. So it's not just spatial locations, it's the moving items that are the problem. So there's a question about whether multiple object tracking has any relevance to practical tasks, and one of the naturals is automobile driving. So as it turns out, a lot of people, certainly when they're, and I'm among them, actually when you're writing your grant applications for insert, you mention driving an automobile, because this would be a case where there's real an impact that everybody can notice. And as it turns out, collisions are one of the leading causes of death, especially for young people. It costs the government millions of dollars every year to in healthcare, in social services, and that sort of thing after people have been in a collision. So it's easy to see that there might be an important practical implication here. And in particular, there's certain aspects of driving that might involve multiple object tracking. One is merging. I don't know if you have these, but roundabouts. Actually, they're trying to introduce these in Canada with, well, some resistance. I did a roundabout study once, and actually, as it turns out, we're trying to see if people could follow the signs to get into the right lane to go into the roundabout. One old guy, actually, it was a lifespan study, one old guy that I tested actually decided that if he had to take a roundabout, he wasn't going to the location he was supposed to get to. He'd rather go elsewhere. Anyway. Another thing is turning left to cross traffic. That would be a case where you definitely need multiple object tracking. Now, as it turns out, older drivers are at disproportionate risk of collisions, especially at intersections. So older drivers are more at risk, partly because they're more likely to die as a result of being in a collision. But actually, there's special situations that they're really at risk, and one is at intersections. And this is despite the fact that they have decades of driving experience. So actually, when a young driver gets into a collision at an intersection, it's often because they don't know where to look, or it never occurs to them that a pedestrian can come up from behind a parked car, let's say. Whereas an older driver knows that. But nonetheless, despite all these decades of experience, and actually many older drivers are acutely aware of their problem at left-hand turns, they still have this problem. Actually, my mother, for example, when she drives, actually driving to Calgary once, she basically tried to plot a route where she only had to turn right. And actually, as it turned out, that made the journey quite a lot longer than it had to be. But you know, they're conscious of it, but still they have this problem. And so maybe this risk at intersection is due to deficits in multiple object tracking. However, as it turns out, multiple object tracking has never been the focus of investigation in the driving literature. And well, part of the reason is because of these two different, division between the two fields, between driving and between the research on attention. There's not much communication. But also, as it turns out, the people in the driving literature are nothing if not really pragmatic. And they say, hey, wait a minute. So this thing with all these circles is going to sort of tell us something about driving? The situation is quite different. And as it turns out, it's so different that you wonder how could it be the same thing? Because typically when you drive down the road, you don't see a number of identical things. When you drive on the road, there's constraints about the positions of what things can locate. They can't be anywhere. They're basically always on the road in front of you. And furthermore, multiple object tracking is demanding enough that you'd wonder, can you drive while you're multiple object tracking? As Brian showed, actually it's effortful, really effortful, especially if it's quite a few. And I guess another additional reason that there might be reluctance here is that actually programming a multiple object tracking task in a driving simulator is tricky. But as it turns out, we tried, and this is what came of it. So actually, one of the first things we had to establish is that multiple object tracking was possible in a vehicle. We had to find out if there was cost to doing it, and also if there were benefits. And finally, we wanted to basically gradually make the multiple object tracking more like a real driving task and see what the implication would be. So I have a driving simulator. So it turns out those evil people at ICBC, they managed to achieve what they wanted to. They basically talked me into going into the driving research. And so I ended up with a driving simulator. And we use it for all sorts of things, but it's a complete car body. Actually, we even do some studies where there's people in the back seat distracting the driver and that sort of thing. And it's got a 300-degree wraparound virtual reality. So you really feel like you're driving. And what happens is that we first of all had to establish tracking. Now typically tracking tasks take place over a period of time. It's often 10 seconds, but actually there have been people who show it can go on for up to 10 minutes. So we had to have an extended period where people were tracking. We made it 30 seconds. And as it turns out, you have a bunch of vehicles in front of you, and we made them all identical, like the circles in the multiple object tracking task. And what the people had to do is they drive behind these cars and actually keep track of some of them. So actually we have to follow those cars. Follow them with your attention, because you're following all of them with your vehicle, but actually some of them you're paying attention to. And so the first thing we asked is, does multiple object tracking interfere with driving? And vice versa. So what we did is we were measuring interference in tracking by comparing single and dual task performance. Drivers either sat passively in the driving seat of a, quote, moving vehicle. Actually, our simulator is a fixed baseline, so you weren't moving anywhere, but at the same time you felt like you were moving. So you're either just viewing the items, tracking them, the cars, or you actually did some tracking while driving. Now, when they were tracking while driving, what they had to do, their task was to maintain their position on the road. So they had to stay in the center of their lane, and they had to stay at the same distance behind the car. So they basically had to have control the longitudinal position of the car and the lateral position. So does driving interfere with tracking? Well, so we had 1, 3, and 4 vehicles to track out of 9. And so this is just a whole bunch of nightmare drivers in front of you. So imagine you have some rowdy drivers that are driving, and they're basically changing lanes all the time and maneuvering for position. And so there's 1, 3, or 4 of those targets you had to track. So what happens is the vehicle would start, some of the cars would flash to indicate they were targets, and then tracking interval would continue. And we compared single task tracking with dual task and looked at the percentage of accurately identified targets. And as you can see, as it turns out, when you're tracking while driving, your performance drops, and it drops more the more targets there are. So there's no significant difference if you're only tracking 1 target, but once you get to be tracking 3 or 4 targets, there is. So that says driving interferes with tracking, but does tracking interfere with driving? Now, as it turns out, you can measure driving performance in a number of different ways. But what we were looking at is lateral and longitudinal stability. So as it turns out, we had 2 groups, and actually one group just drove, that's all they had to do, and the other group drove while tracking 1, 3, or 4 targets while driving. And what we looked at was 2 aspects of driving. We looked at steering performance, which is standard deviation of lateral position. And what that is you're in the center of the lane, and you're looking at whether people vary a lot from the center position. So we're looking at variability in time, because that is a sort of weaving, which is an indication that people aren't driving very well. And the other thing we looked at was headway performance. So how far did they stay from the group they were supposed to be tracking? So we'd have average headway, but we also had headway variability. Because when people, inadvertently speed up and slow down and don't realize that, that's a sign that they're not driving very well. So in terms of the design, single task, dual task, and steering and headway. And what we found is that tracking interferes with driving performance. So as it turns out, the people in the baseline condition, basically when told to just basically follow a given headway and keep it that way, as it turns out, on average, they chose to follow at a greater distance. So as it turns out, they weren't very good at following the directions because we told them to keep the set distance and they decided not to keep the set distance. That's one of the things about applied research. It doesn't work out the way you want necessarily. They chose a different distance. They wanted to give that crazy bunch of drivers that are rapidly changing lanes, they wanted to give them a wide berth. But after that, actually increasing the number of targets has no significant effect. However, as it turns out, you do see evidence of tracking load having an effect on steering variability and headway variability. And what you find is that there's a big difference between 0 and 1, but actually the difference between 1 and 4 is significant. Often what happens is 3 and 1 are similar, they're statistically significant, but actually the problem really starts once there's 4. So as it turns out, it seems like there might be a cost to tracking some items while driving. And so you see standard deviation of headway is measured in meters. Standard deviation of lateral position is also measured in meters. And so what happens is when you're doing both at once, you get more instability. So those are the costs of multiple object tracking while driving. Are there any benefits? And in particular, you'd say, well, okay, so let's say I chose to track some of those vehicles. Do I respond to changes in those vehicles more rapidly than others? You'd expect that to be the case, given what you find in standard multiple object tracking. But I wanted to make sure using a vehicle, because actually there's a lot of differences between driving and just sitting in a chair, and so I wanted to see if there was a relationship. And so I did this with change detection. So this is classic one-shot change detection. So what happens is that the participants are sitting there driving along and they have to identify a change that occurs during a blanking interval. So the blanking interval is like what would happen if you blinked, let's say, it's a global transient. And the reason that you have the blanking interval is that when you have sudden flashes in the image, local transient, it can automatically attract an eye movement. We didn't want that to happen in the study. So I'll give you an example of what this might look in the simulator. Now this isn't a multiple object tracking test, this is change detection in general. But if you're in the simulator, you're seeing something like that. There's your blanking interval. Okay, what changed? So we'll go back.
Got it.
Extra car.
You see that? Okay, so that's a change detection in a simulator. So that's what we did. So we incorporated change detection into a multiple object tracking task. And what they had to do in this case is they had to notice color changes in the vehicles. Actually, we have lots of different colors, up to 9 different colors in the vehicles and all sorts of different models, but we were looking at color changes. Now to do this, though, we'd have to introduce heterogeneity into the vehicle colors. So up to this point, we'd only used identical vehicles. Now normally what happens is if you introduce item heterogeneity into a tracking task, it makes the tracking task a little bit different, easier. Now the other thing that we did is that we had to try to make sure that the targets that we thought were targets were also the ones that the subjects thought were targets. So we basically had to be in a case where the tracking performance was at 100%. So we made the tracking task a little bit more easy. We had 6 vehicles instead of 9, and we had 1 to 3 targets. So, change detection. So in this case, we had people just driving or or people just tracking or driving and tracking. We had the number of targets, 1 and 3, and the vehicle color change. And it was either in a target or a distractor. And we also had some catch trials where there was no change. And we measured the percentage of trials where people correctly identified the vehicle that changed. So this is what a driver would see. So you see those nutty drivers ahead of you jockeying for position, constantly changing for about 30 seconds. And this is the way the trial went. So you started out with tracking, then you'd have a screen flash for 60 milliseconds, and either the target or distractor would change, or you'd have no change. And what people had to do is, first of all, identify the targets, and then identify which item changed. Now what we found was that, as it turns out, there was a difference in that people were better at tracking the targets than the distractors. Now, as it turns out, there was about a 14% benefit to tracking targets. And this was true both in classic tracking, or multiple object tracking, tracking only, and tracking while driving. So actually 16% better if the change is on a target rather than the distractor. However, as it turns out, if you look at those, if you've done a change detection study and you look at those kinds of levels of performance, you would be suspicious, because actually change detection is usually pretty poor. And here people are going, oh my gosh, they're doing very, very well. And there wasn't a lot of false positives. They're actually doing very well, so well that we thought, I don't think that they're only using their tracking information. They might have actually used a strategy of trying to memorize the colors. So as it turns out, we decided to fix that problem up. And in particular, what we had to do is try to figure out a way to have a color change without introducing a new color into the image. So what we did to prevent people guessing based on memorized colors is that we had two vehicles switched colors, so there was no new colors introduced. And so actually this is a change detection task where there are two changes. Two vehicles changed, they swapped colors. And I incorporated response time as well. So we did this study, and we basically looked at vehicles that switched colors. And we had either two targets or two distractors. We didn't tell people that they were going to only targets changed with targets or distractors with distractors. We didn't want to bias them in that way. And as it turns out, they weren't aware of this, because as it turns out, sometimes if they made a tracking error, they would think it would be a target and a distractor that switched. And so we just didn't tell them that they were always going to be a pair. And what we were looking at is how long it took for them to make a decision about which two vehicles switched, and also the percentage of accuracy. So here's how it did, and you'll notice in this case too, what we did is we had change detection first, and then they continued tracking and identified the targets later. Now what we found is actually something was actually a 250 millisecond difference between targets and distractors. And in the driving field, the field of driving, they get very excited if you have a difference of 50 milliseconds. So this is a huge difference. If there's two targets switching, actually people are a quarter second faster. And that would be enough to be an important difference if you talk about collisions. However, as it turns out, if you look at the accuracy, the target switch and the distractor switch are exactly the same. And if you do the math, actually what it seems is actually something that's consistent with something Zenon showed in one of his studies. When you're tracking something, you actually know the difference between the targets and the distractors, but you don't necessarily know the difference between one target and the other target. And so what happens is the performance there in both conditions is what you'd expect if they knew there were 3 targets or 3 distractors, but they didn't know which 2 of the 3 switched. So as it turns out, there was no difference there. But they were a quarter of a second faster when the targets switched. So you might say, well, and actually this is exactly the sort of thing they say at applied driving things is, who cares? How often do vehicles change color? during a drive, and why would we care if they did anyway? So actually, let's change it into something that's a little more safety relevant. So gradually I'm making this task more and more like one that would be carried out on a road. So if people are tracking a vehicle, they should be able to respond more quickly and accurately to that vehicle if that vehicle changes. So can a driver brake faster if, let's say, the turn lights or the brake lights go off in a tracked vehicle than an untracked vehicle? And also, is the driver better at knowing which vehicle braked? And that's an important thing as well, because if you've ever been in a bunch of cars, and actually on the 401 this happens quite often, you have a bunch of cars and somebody up there brakes, and you need to know which lane to go into if you're going to avoid that. However, when we do this, we actually have to introduce a local transient, so there has to be a brightness change. There is no blanking interval. And so actually local transients should automatically attract the attentional focus to that location. And that's typically why they're avoided in change detection studies. But we're going to take off the training wheels and see what it's like in an actual vehicle. So, vehicles that brake. They were either the target vehicle or the distractor vehicle. And we looked at braking reaction time in response to the lead vehicle. So basically, when the lead vehicle had their brake lights go on, you're supposed to hit your own brakes as fast as possible. And then we'd also have them say which vehicle braked. So there's tracking 3 of 6 lead vehicles. So as it turns out, we found no significant differences in braking reaction time, as would be expected if the sudden onset automatically attracted the attentional focus. However, we did find that drivers were 14% more accurate at determining which of the vehicles braked if it was a tracked target as compared to a distractor. So there was an advantage in localization. And that's an important thing if you want to make evasive maneuvers. So there is an advantage. Now the final thing is that when you're driving down the road, unless you have some sort of nightmare situation, you're not faced with identical vehicles. Actually, typically the vehicles differ in color, in shape, and size, and that's another reason they say multiple object tracking is irrelevant to driving, because you know these identical circles, which were important in making the claims that Zenon was making at the time, actually you rarely face that. Now, heterogeneity, the research on heterogeneity in tracking shows that heterogeneity improves multiple object tracking, though it may require extra resources to make use of the heterogeneity information. So if you're going to use, say, I'm going to remember it was the red one that I was going to use, I'm going to remember the location of the red one, that helps, but it requires some extra resources. So what I did is I did something after Makowski and Jiang, and basically we looked at 3 conditions. One where basically all the items were the same color, so they could be all red. Another situation, all the items were different colors. So every target and every distractor, they're all different colors. And finally, we have this paired 4 situation where you have a condition where for every red target, there's also a red distractor. So as it turns out, the heterogeneity should be very helpful in helping you know the difference between targets and distractors. So we had vehicle colors, homogeneous, heterogeneous, and paired 4. And we also had task loads. Single task, people were tracking 4 and 8. And dual task, they were tracking 4 vehicles and 8 while driving. And we looked at the percentage of correctly identified targets, but we also looked at steering performance and headway, mean and standard deviation. So as it turns out, heterogeneity does improve tracking performance, but only when you're tracking in isolation. When you're tracking and driving, it doesn't matter. So as it turns out, the extra load of having to control the position of the vehicle means that you can no longer make use of the heterogeneity information. So heterogeneity does seem to improve steering performance. So that's what we got. So there was a significant difference between the heterogeneous and the homogeneous conditions. but it has no effect on the average headways. Now, as it turns out, the headway stability was a little weird in that we had the condition that actually you should, well, paired 4 should be as bad as homogeneous if you're telling targets from distractors. As it turns out, it was the best when it came to headway deviations. And the homogeneous and the heterogeneous, the ones that should have been the most different, were actually not significantly different from one another. So, vehicle heterogeneity has inconsistent effects on driving performance when people track while driving. And actually, when we find that actually the heterogeneity of items helps when you're tracking in isolation, but not when you're tracking while driving, sort of makes sense in that driving requires working memory resources that makes that extra heterogeneity information unavailable. However, we may have to do some more studies because the driving performance indices aren't making complete sense. So that's what we're doing next. Now, as it turns out, we still have some problems taking this to driving conferences because they say, what? You have them following multiple cars. Now, when would you actually do this? So imagine a situation that you have a bank heist. 4 different burglars got into identical taxis as you're traveling through New York, and you, the police officer following on the motorcycle, has to try to keep track of where all the 4 people are going so you can call it in. Okay, so there is a situation you might need something like that. But right now, anyway, we do show that it can be done in a car, and it has some costs, but it also has some benefits. And now what we have to do is figure out a way to look at left-hand turns, because that is a problem. As it turns out, the driving research on left-hand turn is all focused on where people are moving their eyes. And it is true that older drivers move their eyes differently than younger drivers, but actually where you move your eyes is not predictive of whether you make the right decision. So you could be moving your eyes to exactly the right position and basically pass in front of a car anyway. So as it turns out, that's what we're going to be doing next. So thank you. You must be getting anxious to get home.
We have time for 1 or 2 questions. Brian?
You told me some time ago about senior drivers running into things that they're looking at.
Oh, well, actually, everybody runs into things they're looking at. That's the look but didn't see. But actually, certainly, senior drivers have that problem as well. So actually, I've done a number of studies on older drivers. Actually, one of them was related to in-vehicle technologies like navigation systems.
Yeah.
And as it turns out, many people think navigation systems are the solution. So for example, my father, he was getting up there, actually, and he was from rural Alberta. He decided what he was going to do is he's going to drive to visit my brother in Los Angeles by himself. And he said, but I'll be okay because I have this navigation system. And so the navigation system will prevent you from getting lost. Now, as it turns out, we got very worried, the rest of the family, about my father traveling all by himself to Los Angeles with a nav system. And so my brother went with him, and what he noticed that my dad did is that every time he'd need it most, he'd turn the navigation system off. Because as it turns out, it was that extra thing to attend to, and he couldn't stand it. And actually, my brother ended up doing a lot of the driving as a result. But we've looked at that. We've actually looked at how it is that sometimes older drivers have some wisdom about where their weak points are. Now, as it turns out, their wisdom shows itself in terms of the way they modify their driving performance depending on the environment. So you can make the driving performance more and more complex by adding challenges like fog, like lots of traffic, like a wayfinding task, where you basically make a person say, find their way to Kitchener using the signs and landmarks. Now, what happens with a younger person is that they drive the same speed regardless of the challenge. But what happens with an older driver is with each challenge, they slow down. So it's foggy, they slow down. It's foggy and there's a lot of traffic. They slow down some more. It's foggy, there's lots of traffic, and they're trying to find their way. They slow down some more. And what we found as well is that there's a measure called the useful field of view, which is actually predictive of driving performance in older drivers. Although most people, you wouldn't think that you would intuitively know what your attentional problems are. But actually we found there was a relationship between how much they slowed and their scores on the useful field of view. So as it turns out, we've done a number of studies with older people. One problem is that with simulators, you have a problem called simulator sickness. And actually, older people, especially older women, are inclined to get simulator sickness. Simulator sickness causes a person to, well, in severe cases, throw up. And so, as it turns out, I had one study where I had a 40% attrition rate. And you know, you feel so bad because actually some of these older women, you know, 85, 90 years old, they come in and they so want to contribute to research. And you know, to make a little old lady throw up, it doesn't feel good. and you know, maybe it's something about people who grew up in that generation, but they will not give up. You see them turning green and you say, maybe we should stop now. It would be a good idea. No, gotta power through. And so